Howdy folks, and welcome to episode 3, where we'll be talking to LabyrinthMind, who is a moderator for the UK ADHD subreddit for the social media platform Reddit, that is. Okay, we're talking to LabyrinthMind about ADHD, her personal journey in relation to having the condition, and also getting a diagnosis and also the problems with that, so around misdiagnosis and the problems with the healthcare system that she's encountered. And we'll also be talking finally about the news articles doing the rounds in the media at the moment in the UK with publications in the newspapers around ADHD. There's been a lot of anti-ADHD rhetoric that has been doing the rounds and causing a bit of stigma and misappropriating the messages that we're putting out there, really, around ADHD. So she'll be talking a little bit about that, which should be quite interesting. So I look forward to having you listeners listening to that on episode 3 with LabyrinthMind. Alright, it's really good that she's willing to come on and share her story and talk about some of the things that have been bothering her, and also to comment on some of the messages that we're putting out there in the public domain. Really important to do that, really important. And finally, I just want to quickly mention as well, just as a disclaimer, we will be talking about some sensitive topics, so potentially stuff around self-harm and also sort of negligence from a medical point of view and misdiagnosis, and it might be triggering to some people. Okay, so again, exercise your own discretion, your own caution when listening to that, but please go to your GP if you do have any medical complaints. Don't use our advice as a substitute for medical advice from your doctor, because we're not medical professionals. So although we will talk about medications in this episode, albeit briefly, it's from a personal lived experience point of view, so please go to your doctor if you need medical advice, guys. So with all that being said, guys, I really hope you enjoy episode 3. Really hope you enjoy listening to it. I've enjoyed recording it, and I hope to have you listening to that, and I hope to hear your views on our Facebook page. If you can, please comment, like and subscribe across our channels, across our Facebook page, and if you could share across Spotify as well, share our podcast far and wide. I'd love for it to gain a bit of traction, guys. So thanks again, guys. Thanks for listening, and as always, you take care. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Speak Up podcast. Today it's a special one because we have a guest speaker on who will be discussing ADHD and their own experiences around getting a diagnosis and the associated problems with that. Now, before we begin, I intend for this to be an open dialogue, and the guest speakers will take sort of centre stage, although we'll have some questions to ask as the discussion goes along. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to LabyrinthMind, who is a moderator on the ADHD subreddit on Reddit there. So welcome aboard. It's great that you're willing to come on and share your knowledge and experience with us. Really, all we want you to do is just sort of introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and why did you decide to speak up today?
Yeah, so first of all, forgive me if I cough. I have a constant cough thing. It's really irritating. But yeah, I'm LabyrinthMind. I'm a moderator over on the ADHD UK subreddit. This has popped up in recent times due to how hard it's been for people to get support in the UK for ADHD. I'm also a first-year psychology student. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 35 after a couple of decades of being bounced around and struggling in the NHS. And I was diagnosed via Psychiatry UK and the Right to Choose pathway. And I wanted to come on the podcast today to talk about my ADHD and experiences, because in recent days, there's been quite a few harsh attacks on ADHD and people who have ADHD by the media. And I'm a little bit tired of the fake news that's going around at this point. I also just wanted to share my experiences because they're a thing, and I think it's good to talk about it.
Brilliant. That sounds really good. And just on the bit about LabyrinthMind, do you want us to refer to you as that, or is there any other preferred?
Yeah, okay. I think if we'll just go for lab or something, because otherwise it's going to turn into a bit of a tongue twister. I don't know how many times you have to say it.
Bit of a mouthful for a Sunday.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll refer to you as lab as we go through if we need to refer back. But So I've just got a few questions really, and some of them are quite basic to start off with, just to get us into the swing of it. But just to start briefly, can you outline to us what ADHD is from your point of view and from the sort of general consensus?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the lead on this we wrote an FAQ, me and another mod, RJ, and it took us quite a while, but I think it probably sums it up. So I'm going to sort of borrow a bit from that. But
Okay.
ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects an individual's ability to focus, control impulses, regulate activity levels. And neurodevelopmental disorders are complex conditions that are like characterized by differences in cognition, communication, behavior, sometimes motor skills, and it results from how a person's brain developed early on in life. And generally speaking, people with ADHD might have difficulty paying attention, sitting still, controlling their behavior sometimes. They tend to be easily distracted, forgetful, and impulsive. But there are also 3 different types of ADHD which impact how those symptoms manifest and how often they manifest. So you've got inattentive type, that's me. You've got hyperactive type, that's the stereotype of the 7-year-old boy misbehaving in the classroom. And then you've got combined type, where you've a bit from column A, a bit from column B. And I think the best thing to remember about ADHD is it's a disorder of attention regulation, in that people with ADHD can't easily control what they are paying attention to. Because it's very easy to think, oh, it's because you can't pay attention to anything. No, you can, but you can't control it. That's sort of the difference there.
Okay, yeah, well, that's a really good sort of overview, really, of what ADHD is. So thank you for that. So in terms of like symptoms to look out for and things like that, it's sort of like impulsivity and inattentiveness and the inability to pay attention to things. Is that right?
It is that, but it's also quite a lot more.
Yeah.
So with ADHD, like you could just list out the symptoms of ADHD, but the problem with ADHD symptoms is that it's really hard to realize what those symptoms actually look like in reality if you've spent your entire life like masking and overcompensating for these issues that you have. So this is the main reason why those news articles I mentioned are like going on about how it's so easy to say you have ADHD, because they're taking things that are actually quite complicated and reducing them to very simplistic things. So like, this is why I think we need to have more nuanced conversations. So I'll give you an example. So women tend to experience inattentive ADHD. So on paper, inattentive ADHD can look a bit like, often has trouble holding attention on tasks, and you're easily distracted, doesn't seem to listen when spoken to, has trouble organizing things, is often forgetful and distracted by things like their own thoughts, stuff like this. However, inattentive ADHD in me, who is a person who has this, actually looks more like this. So I'm a woman with a lifelong history of mental health problems that never responded to any therapy, SSRIs, or any intervention of any kind. I've had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is like what it's called now, but it never fit me. And I've always had some sort of weird problem with my sleep, no matter what I did about it. I was never referred to a sleep clinic because people just told me to give up the caffeine I was using to function, and I couldn't. I didn't have the willpower to chase them about it, despite the sleep disorder literally destroying my life. It's called delayed sleep phase disorder. It's actually surprisingly common with ADHD. I didn't know that. So I've also got 3 learning disabilities. So the learning disabilities are a thing that co-occur very often with like any sort of, it's autism, all sorts of things. So I've got dyscalculia to a really severe level, dyslexia, that's the maths one, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, which is dyspraxia is like the coordination one. Obviously, dyslexia is where like you have trouble reading and all that sort of stuff. And I've literally got like a mental age of about 7 in maths, but I've never been assessed for any of this until I paid for an assessment myself. I was like 36. And I had all of these learning disabilities ignored for my entire education life. And this, along with being a chronic daydreamer, is the reason why I basically didn't get any GCSEs at all, despite doing really well if there was like coursework or homework. I failed college 4 times. 4 times, that's quite impressive. Wow. I think I have a record there in the making. I've also had severe depression and anxiety for like my entire adult life. and I've spent my life living in a state of permanent, unexplainable chaos. I once became, for a very long time actually, completely lost in my own imaginary world, and I thought I had something called maladaptive daydreaming, but it's ADHD. And I coped with all of this weirdness by playing computer games pretty obsessively. So I played a lot of MMOs, World of Warcraft, all that stuff, like obsessively, a lot. To this day, I still don't often know what day of the week it is. I can't ever find things. I get fired from every job I've ever had, I have and have ever had. And people generally treat me pretty poorly because they see my problems as character flaws instead of being like a part of a complex web of neurological differences. So all of that is why people don't understand what ADHD actually is when they write about it for their articles. Because that's a lot more than has trouble holding attention on tasks or activities. It's like I failed college 4 times. That's what that means, if you see what I mean. It's like it doesn't have to be that severe, like at all, but that's what I mean. It's when it becomes like a serious impairment, you know, that's when it of any kind, that's when it's more like ADHD than just I don't know, I could be bothered, which is what people seem to think it is.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's more nuanced, isn't it? You know, there's a long pattern of being unable to do certain things, and also like, it sounds like it's been a real difficult time for you up until getting that diagnosis and having to pay for it as well yourself. And did you say you did say you paid for it yourself, right?
I paid for my learning disability assessments myself. I don't even know that the NHS do them. Like literally, I don't think they do them. I could be wrong, but I'd like to know if they do because it's a bit weird. Um, but no, I went through right to choose, which is if you're in England, it's a legal right you can basically invoke to choose your provider. So like if the waiting lists on the NHS are too long, in my case there was 4 years, 4 or 5 years, something like that. It's 5 years for autism. I know that much, but it's 4 years I think for ADHD where I lived. um, it allows you to like name a provider who will be able to carry out that assessment if they're on the thing. So I chose Psychiatry UK because at the time they were basically the only one that I knew about. They've now become almost like a subcontractor for the NHS to do ADHD assessments because of the waiting times. So you don't have to pay for it if you do that. But again, there's always that waiting list thing. And the problem with ADHD is I think when you know that you have it in your heart, you can't really wait. You know, you've been waiting long enough already by the time you realize you have it. It's how it feels like. And it's
Yeah,
really painful knowing there's a medication maybe out there for you that will really help you, and you can't have it no matter how much you beg, plead, scream, cry, nothing. You have to go through this process. That's painful actually.
yeah, yeah, and I think as well it's like very similar to autism, because I'm actually suspected of having autism, and I've always felt like not like the odd one out, but very different to other people, and I'm actually on the pathway of getting a diagnosis, and I've yet to I'm waiting for an assessment actually. And I'm still waiting for that assessment, and
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's going to be a real eye opener for me in terms of getting a diagnosis and it all making sense as to why I am like I am and why I had a lot of the same struggles as yourself. Actually, you know, I found it hard to hold down jobs and things, but mainly for different reasons. But it might turn out that I am autistic, and it might make perfect sense to me, although it might not. You know.
Yeah.
But that's a really good snapshot, really, into what it's been like for you, you know, in general, you know. So thanks for sharing that with us. That's really valuable, and I'm sure other people will be able to take a lot of value from that. Um, in terms of like barriers and stuff to getting support, what's been the biggest barrier to you getting support?
Oh, okay. So let me just think for one moment. So for me, I would say, right, so I'm going to I'm going to start by saying, first of all, I do understand the problems that the health service does have and the pressures it's under, and the professionals are dealing with all sorts of crazy stuff all the time. I'm not unsympathetic to it. I actually genuinely hope that some sort of meaningful change happens soon for them because no one deserves to be worked to death, just period. Like they don't deserve it. No one does. But then here's the but. So to answer the question, what's been the biggest barrier in one sentence, or I'd have to give the crown of the biggest barrier to misdiagnosis and the stigma which is attached to conditions I don't actually have, but I've been misdiagnosed as having by the NHS. So I spent a really, really long time like decades, being told that my problems, as I said, were things like borderline personality disorder, which, as I understand it, is a depressingly common situation that people who have ADHD and also autism as well seem to be going through en masse, like especially if you're a woman. But it does also feel like, from my perspective, purely from my perspective, that if they kind of can get you with something like that, then they will do, regardless of your gender. So the only thing that, in terms of getting help, anyone would do to help me was give me really bad SSRIs that never worked
Yeah.
on me, and throw me into what seemed like seemingly endless rounds of CBT. And it's really sad to me because there are people out there who would possibly actually benefit from that CBT, but they can't get it. And meanwhile, I'm stuck in like this CBT nightmare. So like, this became a barrier for me because the CBT sessions became increasingly and genuinely traumatic for me, because nobody identified at any point that the reason the CBT wasn't working wasn't because my thoughts needed changing as such, but because I actually just kind of think differently to the therapists that were doing it, honestly. So like, the therapists would often act like I didn't know my own mind, but it's actually the opposite in my case. I've spent a really long time trying to learn my mind.
Yeah.
So if I showed the therapist, look, I'm aware of this behavioral cycle and I don't do it, they just not believe me for some reason. Or if I, like, I knew something was wrong beyond just a personality disorder diagnosis, but they would turn away from me when I explained to them how I didn't fit this criteria by like two things. It was like emotional dysregulation, but that's an ADHD thing too. So it's like, I didn't fit the criteria. You need 5 things to qualify, and I only ever got like 2. And I used to get really angry at them. And I remember once saying to a therapist something like, the only stormy interpersonal relationship I have is with you, because I'm getting so frustrated that they just won't listen to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's like, I'm neurodivergent and not mentally ill, and I didn't know this, and they never considered it. So they'd be treating like my anxiety and depression or whatever it was they thought I had, like it was a mental illness, instead of asking me the questions like, why is it you feel incapable of relaxing for seemingly no reason? And like, what do you mean you can't seem to ever turn your mind off? Like, no one ever wanted to explore those things. They only ever wanted to bang on at me about emotional regulation or something, or like invalidating my emotions at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, I completely relate to that. Even for things like mental health and stuff, in my experience, when practitioners, they're very clear to, they're very quick to ask you, okay, so what's the issue that you've got, and then when you tell them, they invalidate it and tell you it's something else, and it's like they're not really listening, as much.
They can kind of get railroaded. It's not even their fault, really. It's part of how I think it's, because I'm training to be one now. He's not a cognitive behavior one, but a psychologist anyway. And it's kind of like I can start to see already in my baby year one mode that I'm in where the problems begin. It's like I have classmates sometimes who say really like classist stuff because they're quite well off or whatever, and it's like no one tells them to get out of that, or it'll be like other things that you see people doing and no one ever corrects them or stops them. Like, I got laughed at because I mentioned something about how, like, they were talking about conditioning and they were like, oh, this item, who is it aimed at? And I said someone who's got enough money to buy the thing and then the room to have the thing in their house. And everyone laughed at me because the idea that people couldn't afford this thing was weird to them. And I'm like, wow, okay, I feel a bit weird now.
Well, that's true. It's true, and it's really good that you spoke out about that as well, because people need to hear this stuff, don't they?
Yeah.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier about articles, you said, that have been out that are quite anti-ADHD. Do you want to expand a little bit more about that, or talk a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so it really upset me. I think it upset quite a lot of people on the Reddit. So there was this debate in Parliament on like the 6th of February, and it was motioning to create like an emergency assessment fund for ADHD and autism assessments. And it was a debate which didn't meet the minimum criteria for a parliamentary debate, but they did it anyway, which I actually thought was quite cool of them. And then in the week leading up to this debate, there was something like 3 articles in the Daily Mail, 1 in the Spectator, 1 in the Times. This is what I know of. And all of these articles were like hit pieces on ADHD as a condition. So actually, I'd like to give a special shout out to The Guardian as well, because while they didn't get on that particular "We Hate ADHD" bandwagon, they did post some really vile things on their website previously, not too long ago. So I don't actually see why they should escape just because they didn't do it this time. But it's not okay. So all of these articles followed the same sort of attack pattern, which is like tinfoil hat mode, like who's got a thing against ADHD in the press usually. So it was all things like celebrities getting diagnosed has made ADHD a trendy thing, or like, look, everyone's a bit ADHD, or like, I can do this test and score positive for ADHD. The whole thing's a sham. And then it's like TikTok's corrupting the youth, and then giving drugs to children is bad. So they were all a bit like that. And like there was a lot of ADHD as a personality flaw and all this kind of stuff in there too. It was really awful.
Yeah.
And so people, bless them, were posting these things on our Reddit, like members, and also a mod did it, because I think we can't help but go towards the siren song of it. Like people, it triggers something in the mind where like the thing is with ADHD, we like our dopamine and we like things that trigger dopamine, and like something like that will trigger it. It triggers the interest and like the adrenaline response and like all this. It's quite good for the brain, but bad in a lot of ways. So people are getting upset reading these articles, and we're like a large community of ADHD people, but we're not like super massive. So countering these sorts of things is really difficult. You know, one of the people who wrote one of the articles said something like she spent 25 years on the gear. She's talking about cocaine or something like that. But like they'll give her a voice, but they won't give like one of us a voice. So we'll listen to 25 years on the gear lady, but not someone who actually has ADHD. And so yeah, that was what happened there. It's bad.
Yeah, not good. So with all that being said then, so what's is there any sort of therapy or support that you are getting, you know, in and amongst all this stuff that's happening? Are you getting any support at the minute? Are you happy to share anything around that? Or
yeah, so I've had a bit of a bumpy road with it, but that's fine. I think everyone has their own thing to go through at the end of the day. Sometimes I think it can be quite okay. Other times you run into problems with like your GP if they won't do like a shared care agreement, all sorts of things like this. It's like, but I've had some problems in my case with my blood pressure. So I'm not on like my ideal dose at the moment for my medication. But basically, what happened was, essentially the NHS stressed me out so hard due to an event where I ended up in A&E, and they accused me of doing a thing to myself what I hadn't done, and they did it. They accused me of doing it because I'm on ADHD meds. So they was implying that I'm like a meth addict, and I'd like scratched myself, but I'd had an accident and it had been infected. So I was really, really ill. So I went into like, you know, because I thought I was getting sepsis, but they then didn't care. So they stressed me out so hard with that, because at the same time I had to do uni coursework or I'd have put my degree in jeopardy. So I was like borderline getting a bit like seriously ill and having to do an essay at the same time. And it basically broke me. Like I used every single ounce of energy I had and then more. I like aged in years in like a week. I got like, you know, I really suffered from that, and I've never quite recovered. And I think it's just sort of done something to like my ability to tolerate my ADHD meds. So I'm having to be on like quite a low dose of stuff right now, and take like little booster things to like help me out to like when I have to focus on like a lecture or something.
yeah,
I was supposed to stop having like my medication adjusted ages ago, but because of this sort of stuff, I can't. I basically think I lost one of my 9 lives.
yeah,
Basically. So the things that have helped me outside of that, because I can't entirely rely on medication anymore. Like I was to begin with, and it was pretty good. It doesn't cure everything. It just allows you the space to try to channel and direct yourself. Like that's I think the best thing with about the medication. It gives you the choice, you know, at least sometimes. It's not all the time.
yeah,
But like I think focusing on my uni work has been really like it's been quite a rehabilitation thing for me, because I failed so much in work, education, and now I'm medicated, I can actually study, at least try to. And I've had quite a bit of like naysay from like the place I'm studying at, because people say things and they don't think about why that's probably not a good thing to say, you know. So because of like my learning disability, they're like, you'll never be able to do psychology, it's full of maths. It's like, well, I got a distinction, ha, you know.
Yeah.
I'm on my way. So stuff like that has been quite rehabilitative. It's like our Reddit has been really good, because it's nice. I haven't found like NHS peer support things to necessarily be that good. They tend to be kind of policed in a way. Like I've had it before. I've said something in like a group therapy setting or something, and I've been like sort of told off for it, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I told a lady who blatantly had autism that she should think about like autism stuff, like maybe read up on it or something. Just something. It was gentle. It was really gentle. I got told off though. You can't go diagnosing people. I literally didn't, but I mean, you know, no one was telling her, and I was like, I think she needs to know. You know, it's only fair.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got like told off there. And yeah, it's like I found some like there's been quite a lot of technological based things that have been useful. From obviously like living by the calendar and things like that, but also weirdly, Chat GPT of all things, you know, the AI that everyone's hating on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not using it like for using it for your uni work. No. However, why it's good is it can give you interesting perspectives on things that you might not have considered. So I've been using it to like help me out like with all sorts of little things. Like if I want to ask, you know, a teacher something random, or somebody something random, I can ask and it will help. So you can ask it about ADHD stuff, and even if it's not necessarily true, it gives you like a perspective, and you can go off on a mission to go see if there's any research on it or something like that. So I'd be really interested if they like generated one of those things for like as a disability aid. Actually, I think that would be really good. And yeah, lots of like software that helps you like with other things like writing and stuff like that too, because of all of the other things we've got going on.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, technically the technology and stuff, it's like the way forward, isn't it? Just in terms of support and things like that. My next question was basically going to be about what do you think is the way forward, but I guess you've already answered that, haven't you? Really, in terms of the technology and stuff like that, and for the treatment of ADHD as well. I mean, at the minute, obviously we've touched on your particular treatment, that you're on medication at the minute, aren't you? Like you've said. Are these stimulants that you're taking at the minute, and what's the downsides of that, would you say?
Yeah, okay. So I'm taking one medication that isn't a stimulant. That's called guanfacine. Hopefully I said that right. It's a blood pressure medication that is used to help manage ADHD. I basically just use it to counteract the effects of the stimulants, but it is actually a legitimate option if you can't have a stimulant, you could take guanfacine and technically it would help. It's a little bit unconventional, I think, in the UK, but I think they do use it quite a lot in America. Then I forgot what the question was.
Yeah, it was around is it stimulants that you're taking, and what's the downsides of it? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So stimulants have they're a little bit of a mixed bag. They're relatively good. So like when you've got ADHD, generally speaking, the thing that everybody's worried about, which is like you'll take it and become a massive drug addict, and like your children are on meth. It's like that doesn't really happen when you have ADHD. Like if a neurotypical person takes the medication, they tend to get quite high, I suppose. I don't actually know what it is that they get, but it seems to be some sort of a high or euphoria, or it seems to distort their beliefs so that when they use it, like, because obviously the common one is like using ADHD meds for study drug abuse, isn't it? So it's like people believe, and this has been proven, scientifically proven, that if they take ADHD medication while they're studying, it will get them amazing grades and all this. Actually, it makes them perform worse, because I think it makes them a bit ADHD because they can't regulate their attention. Like they're just going off on like a wild ride, you know. So, but when you have ADHD, it just allows you an opportunity to try and take advantage of moments of focus, really. And the downside of it, at least for me, and I think for a few people, is the one I'm on, Elvance, can give you really bad anxiety, which is not great because obviously you want to keep your heart rate like, chilled out, not going crazy, because like it's damaging if it gets too bad. So it can sort of mess around with your heart rate because it's a stimulant. It can make you really anxious, like painfully anxious. What else? Gives you like a dry mouth. That's why sometimes I probably sound a bit weird. It's because I have to keep drinking all the time because like my mouth gets
Yeah.
really dry. Um, it's like, but other than that though, they're relatively like they're pretty safe. I mean, you've got to like monitor your blood pressure and stuff and send it to like your doctor, or if it's like at your GPs, you'd have to go in for regular checkups, things like that. And you've got to like ideally cut out things like caffeine that you might be like addicted to because you're using it to like medicate before you got you. But it's not good to like have loads of caffeine, like having an energy drink on ADHD medication. Oh, it's not fun. I did it once and I did because I forgot I'd taken my meds, and I did it and I was like, oh no, it wasn't good. I don't recommend it.
Running on all cylinders then.
Yeah, oh, it was not good. I felt ill that day. I felt not nice. Like I wasn't like in danger, but no, not good.
Yeah. So, well, that's a really good account of everything, really. We've actually got through most of the questions, actually. But if there's anything, was there anything that you wanted to add at all that you might think be of any value to listeners and things?
Yeah, I suppose for me it's a little bit more about the things that people say about ADHD or say to people who have ADHD. That using those like that media as the things in the media as an example. So for example, like everyone's a bit ADHD. I want to go over those sorts of things really briefly, just because
Yeah.
they're said really often and they're really damaging, and it's partly where a lot of the stigma from the NHS comes from, I think. So, like with everyone's a bit ADHD, it's like one of those ones is like everybody feels sad sometimes, like it's just going to happen, it's part of life. But if it becomes a chronic and debilitating and enduring issue, we will probably class that as a disorder, that sadness, and then treat it somehow, therapy or medication. And we do the same thing with ADHD, because when you have it to that level, it tries its level best to wreck your life. So there's that one. And then there's things like, you can do a test, score positive for ADHD, and then just, walk in and get drugs and get drugs and cocaine from your doctor, right? So a questionnaire does not an ADHD diagnosis make. So you've got to give them a lot more than just a score to actually qualify. They want your school reports, and they want us to designate someone to write something called like an informant report, which made me laugh so much. And the informant report, it backs up what you've been saying that your life has been like, basically. Um, and not everybody can actually do that though, because not everyone keeps their reports. Like, if you're like 68 or something, or even if you're not, even if you're like 30, why would you necessarily have your reports? Like, would you have to be lucky that your parents are, one, still alive, and two, kept them all? So my mum has passed on, so I couldn't choose her as my informant. You know what I mean? So it creates these like complexities really easily. It's a flawed thing. So it's
Yeah.
not just a case of you do a bunch of things and, oh, I've got an ADHD, give me my cocaine, please. And you
Yeah.
got like, yeah, it was one more, I guess. It's like celebrities getting diagnosed has made ADHD trendy. You can also, put TikTok. TikTok has made it trendy. No, it's the medical profession has did a really bad job like in the 90s. So everybody's here like 20 years later or something, wondering why everything they touch just turns to dust. Like maybe if they didn't label every single woman as having a personality disorder that they don't have, we wouldn't have this level of ADHD assessment need. And likewise, if boys weren't, left behind in education and stuff, as they have been in the past, and labeled as troublemakers or ignored, then we wouldn't have those men finally putting the pieces together now and trying to get the help they deserve. It's like,
Yeah.
it's just that basically.
Yeah, you've really summed up how I feel, actually, because especially that last part when you said there's an awful lot of women that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and I found that a lot just sort of like from my own personal experience, I've met a lot of women with BPD. I'm not saying there isn't any men with it, because there probably will be.
Yeah, it
But
does
that's
exist. It's just
interesting. There's an interesting sort of like situation there, and obviously, as you've just said as well, there's a lot of boys that are diagnosed with, overly diagnosed maybe with ADHD, because they've got like naughty, well, they call it like, like naughty boy problems, if I'm going to generalize.
yeah,
Or you've got the boys that are super quiet who are trying to piece it together now. And I guess I was one of those people at school where I was dead quiet, very shy, very insular. And now I'm only just coming to grips with the fact that I might be autistic, and I might not be, but I don't know that yet. Well, that's really interesting what you said about there seems to be more women with BPD diagnoses.
yeah. It's other stuff as well. Like there's just really quickly on that, because it is an interesting point. There's like other things that really, really hide ADHD as well, like PTSD and complex PTSD. Like if you have, autism or ADHD or any of those sorts of conditions, you're so much more statistically likely to have trauma, because it makes you vulnerable to abuse and things. And so then the symptoms of some of those other disorders then like it hides the ADHD bit, because it's like people will attribute your issues of focus, say, to your trauma and things like that. Because I've had that as well, where someone finally goes, "Oh, it's not borderline, it's trauma," but they're still then not looking at the intersection between like, well, why do you then have this problem reading a book? And it's not to do with your dyslexia, just you can't focus on it, even though you really like this book about dragons or something.
Yeah.
So it's subtle.
Yeah, little differences, isn't it, between what one diagnosis might be and what another one might be. It's interesting as well. You mentioned CPTSD. Personally speaking, I've had people mention to me, like professionals and stuff, say that I'm showing a lot of the symptoms of CPTSD. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but it's interesting that there's a lot of similarities between the CPTSD, autism, and ADHD. They all seem to have a lot of different similarities.
Yeah,
Sorry, that's a bit of a contradiction. Different
I know.
similarities,
Yeah, I know
but
what you meant.
you know,
So like that's an interesting thing, just really quickly on that as well, because the prevailing theory on that, at least that I've seen, I quite agree with, is that the world is really hostile if you have like any kind of neurodivergence of any kind, effectively. So it kind of naturally puts you in a position where you might end up being traumatized. So yeah, that's why it's one of the many reasons why it makes you vulnerable, and also the world seems a bit more hostile.
yeah, it's like an underlying intrinsic vulnerability because of the neurodivergence sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. That. Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of it, really. I've run out of questions to ask you, but it's been really interesting and really good and really informative to talk to you, especially from you coming from a psychology background. It's really interesting. So thank you for sharing, your experiences. I think one of the questions I do want to ask you, just to sort of finish off, what do you think what's your biggest sort of advice you'd give to someone who is in who sort of might think that they have ADHD? What's like the first steps for them? What would you advise them if you was to put that hat
Yeah.
on and kind of advise them? What would you say?
Okay, so the first thing I would advise them is that after they've done their reading and they've done their tests and they're looking at the scores and they're all quite high and they're going, I wonder. From that point, I'd say the first thing you need to do is trust your gut. Now, you obviously don't know for sure that you have ADHD, but there's going to be quite a lot of people who at that early stage are going to tell you for no reason that you don't. So the first thing you've got to do is hold to your beliefs for a bit, like quite strongly. Go to a GP, and if the GP you speak to isn't sympathetic, get a new one until they will refer you. If you're in England, via right to choose. It's different in different parts of the UK. I'm not an expert on what you do there, but generally speaking, you get a referral either through right to choose or somewhere else. Now, if you're somewhere else and the waiting lists are forever, that's where it's really sad. And honestly, your best bet is to probably save up some money and pay for an assessment. But before you do that, make sure that your GP will accept a shared care agreement so that they don't leave you in the lurch when it's time to transfer your medication management back basically to the GP to prescribe. It's because a lot of GPs will go, no, I don't want to. And it's really weird that it's a thing they do. They just don't like doing it. But if you're going through right to choose and everything, you know, that's a really good one if you can do it, because it's effectively still like the NHS, but the waiting list is way shorter. I think there's going to be, it's really common that when you're searching for this diagnosis and like the truth more specifically, I think there'll be a lot of self-doubt. That's normal. Like everybody feels like that. That's where things like our Reddit can be useful because you can talk to people in the same boat and other places of support if you have found them. That's good. If you then get a diagnosis, I want to point out that it's actually kind of, for most people, a really sad experience because you get into like this sort of state of grief whereby you're sad for the years you've missed, you know, like it's robbed you, many people like over 10 years of their life. For me, I was like 35 when I got diagnosed, like all of my 20s, my teenage years, my child, all gone to like a world of chaos, you know. So you grieve for a while. That's also completely normal. I don't know anyone who hasn't. Um, when you're being told like, you know, you have to wait to begin titration, which is where they like begin to administer medication and stuff, get some form of counselor because that can be a long wait, and that is a bad wait because you know it's right there, the thing that will help you, and you can't have it, and it will drive you mad if you're not careful. It drove me mad. So yeah, I recommend some form of counselor, probably just a counselor. I don't think you would need anything more than that, just someone to help you like unload that stress. um and then my final bit of advice is when medical professionals like doubt you or they treat you poorly, because I think that happens sometimes. I mean, it's happened to me a lot, but if they do, um honestly, stick to you. Like, don't let them try and talk you out of like, because I've had NHS people try to talk me out of taking my medication because they didn't like it and stuff, and I'm like, nope, don't let them do that. um no, you stay with your specialists and ignore the people saying things to you like, oh well, if you come off your medication you could manage it with mindfulness or something like. Yeah, so it's sad because it involves a lot of willpower, and willpower is something that people with ADHD struggle with. So if you can get help, do. That'd be my advice.
That's great. Yeah, that's really good and really comprehensive response. And you mentioned as well mindfulness. I think that tends to be a very common answer to a lot of problems, especially within the NHS. Is mindfulness. I'm not disputing that it's not helpful to some people, but it's not the be all end all answer, is it? As well.
No, it's unfortunate because like, you know, I once went into like a crisis walk-in center. I'd had like a traumatic event because someone had had a medical emergency and I helped them, and that was a lot. It was a lot for me to deal with. And I was quite shaken up by it. I went into the crisis center thing and like they were being kind of nice to me, but a bit, I don't know, a bit off. And then they asked me about like, do you know, like, do I have any medications, all this stuff, and it's all about my ADHD. And like, they just sort of switched from being nice about, you know, mindfulness with the thing that you just experienced to like being really harsh about the medication I'm on and stuff, and telling me to like manage ADHD with mindfulness and all this stuff. And I'm like looking at them going, you're not qualified to tell me this stuff. It was like a mental health nurse. I'm like, you have qualifications, but you're not a psychiatrist. Like, you know, stop
Yeah.
it. Don't do this to people. So that is a thing. And like GPs not understanding quite what it does. I don't know why, but sometimes they don't. You have to explain to them what it is and what it does. And they don't really like it. And so it's weird. Because people view you as being really suspicious if you actually have medical knowledge and you're not a doctor. They definitely view you with suspicion, but then they don't know because it's not a drug they encounter often. So you have to tell them anyway. Like, it's very complicated sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a biggie, isn't it? Like, especially with like they always say, don't they, the the patient knows themselves. They know themselves better than anyone. And sometimes when you do go to the doctors, or even in my experience, when you speak to mental health professionals in the mental health team, they will treat you with hostility, especially when you appear to have a little bit more knowledge than what a lot of other people would, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a fine line, isn't it, to tread, you know.
Yeah, it's like, it's a shame, really. I think it's because they are under a lot of stress. I still don't think it entirely excuses it when it happens, and I don't like, from my, it's pure anecdotal experience, but it seems to have happened quite a lot. There have been places where I found it to like not be like that. So like some NHS like group therapy things I've actually actually found to be quite good. Maybe it's because there's so many people there or something, so it like stops those power dynamics from forming. Because like the problem with it in the sort of thing we're talking about is it's like you in a room with a person who has all the power, and if they're having like a bad day or things aren't going right, or maybe if they're just not a nice person, or they're not thinking quite what's going on, that can really affect you, that use of power, if it's used in the wrong way. Because in group therapy it's a bit more shared. So I oddly, even though I could despise group therapy in a lot of ways, I actually prefer it because of the power dynamics in it.
Yeah, definitely. It's I've not had experience of group therapy, so it's good to get that unique insight to it, really, and for it to be mentioned here, really. But yeah, a really good account there, Lab, definitely. We've sort of come to an end, really. Is there any final points you wanted to add?
Just to believe that you know your own mind, I think, because I think that knowing your own mind is the way that you'll be able to stay the course, and it will stop people being able to manipulate you, especially if you are someone susceptible to manipulation because of the conditions you have. So if you can learn your own mind and learn who you are and know that, I think it can help you going forwards. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. That's great. Right. So what we'll do is we'll wrap up now. But thank you very much, Lab, for your contribution. It's been really helpful for me, and I hope for listeners as well to hear your story and for you to speak up, really, and about your experiences. And I look forward to releasing this and having people see what they think, really. I think it's really useful for other people. So thank you very much for that.
No worries.
So I just want to say as well, just now we're at the end, really, is that we're not a medical sort of podcast. So any medical stuff we've talked about, it's not a substitute for advice from your GP. Although obviously the medication side of things is a personal point of view that me and Lab have spoke about, and obviously you as a patient, you know yourself better than anyone. So hopefully our discussion sort of empowers you to take have those decisions made for yourself and have that autonomy. So thank you very much, Lab. We'll bring that to a close, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you.
Take care. Bye now. Bye. Well, that was episode 3, folks. I do hope you enjoyed listening to that. Special thanks to our guest Lab for sharing her personal journey and experiences of having a diagnosis with ADHD, and also for sharing her personal struggles in relation to getting that diagnosis and the misconceptions around ADHD in the media. We had a discussion around that. It's really good to get that out there in the public domain for awareness more than anything. So thank you very much to Lab for that. We really appreciate her coming on and having a willingness to come on and share her story. So thank you very much for that. Again, we're not a medical podcast, so just another disclaimer. We're not a medical podcast, so anything we talk about in relation to medications and things like that, you must always cross-check it with your GP and always seek your GP's advice. It's not a substitute for professional medical advice from your doctor. So just bear that in mind, folks. So that's it for this episode, folks. We look forward to having you in episode 4 listening in. Thanks again, folks.